Hello, ladies and gentlemen. This is Nishant, and welcome to another episode of the Nishant Garg Show. The mission of the show is to spread awareness on mindfulness practices, psychology, mental health, and spirituality. My job on the show is to invite world-class performers to share the practices to live a fulfilled life. This episode guest is Teresa. Teresa is a human first and an alchemist second. She believes that the synthesis of one's intellectual quotient, IQ, personality, and emotional quotient, TQ, is the key to breaking through one's talent quotient, TQ. As an entrepreneur and founder of her personal brand and the formula IQ+EQ TQ, she is passionate about emotional intelligence as a key ingredient to leveraging your IQ and personality. Teresa has been focused on transforming individuals, teams, and organizations to greater levels of performance since 1998 and has experienced leading teams and organizations through the highest of and the most challenging changes. Now let the episode begin. Teresa, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Nishant.
My pleasure. And how would your family describe what you do for a living?
That is such a lovely question. And I laugh right off the bat because I think my husband, my son would certainly just go straight into saying she teaches people about emotional intelligence. And it's very sort of logical for them. Friends that I have these conversations with when we're running would likely describe it as she really listens to what I'm experiencing. And then she asks me really good questions to help me sort of figure it out. And then she reminds me there's emotional information involved. And she gets me to pay attention to that information, which is really important.
Interesting. So listening to your friends come from the skill set of emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
By the way, what is emotional intelligence for our listeners who are not aware of this?
I like to describe it really simply as it's our ability to understand our emotional information. And that information includes knowing what our emotions are when we're experiencing them, what the triggers to those emotions are, our belief systems, assumptions, and experiences all attached to it. And then knowing how to use that emotional information to regulate ourselves so that we can do things like assert our opinion in a way that is non-destructive to other people, that we can demonstrate empathy and understanding someone else's perspective without interrupting or judging or trying to solve the problem, that we can tolerate and cope with really stressful and difficult situations. We're flexible and adaptable within our emotions. We can sit with other people and be really creative when we're trying to problem solve or make decisions. So it really does provide us with a capability to perform at a higher level and leverage our IQ.
And speaking of emotional intelligence, this is becoming very popular worldwide, and still there are a lot of people who are not aware of this. And before we get into that, I would love to ask you, how did you get into emotional intelligence business?
The business itself, prior to becoming an EQ practitioner and deciding that this was going to be the thing that I was going to do, I was leading a learning and development department for 16 years. And part of that department's MO and initiative and goal, was to be able to provide leadership development and leadership programming to the organization. And what we were noticing was that several people would come back to leadership courses saying that they were having a difficult time implementing the processes that they learned, or they're having a difficult time following the steps that they were given. And when I took the time to investigate further and have conversations with these individuals, it really wasn't that they didn't understand the content of the leadership programming. It was that they lacked the underlying emotional intelligence skills to execute on those pieces. So, for example, they had low emotional self-awareness. So they weren't aware when an individual's body language triggered an emotion in them, which resulted in the behavior of avoidance or resulted in the behavior of aggression. And because they weren't aware of that triggering pattern and weren't aware of then the behavior that resulted, they were incapable of then executing the steps afterwards because they were blocked. They couldn't access their IQ because their emotional information was driving the bus, so to speak.
And how did they know that they are not emotionally intelligent?
This is a difficult thing for an individual to say, oh my gosh, that's what I'm lacking. It's a little bit more that other people grace us with feedback. And if we're paying attention to the feedback, we'll start to hear that what we're lacking in is the understanding of our emotional drivers. And we might hear things like, when someone challenges you, your face gets all mangled up. When we're needing to make a change, you get really argumentative. And if we pay attention to those kinds of pieces of feedback that may come our way, we can probably start to piece together that we're lacking in emotional intelligence.
And this feedback is not something verbal. It can be verbal feedback from another person.
That's right. It can be. Some people have the courage to give us that feedback right to our faces.
Honest feedback.
Yeah. Sometimes we will get it from other people's body language. Like we see people shut down in front of us and we're like, why does this person not want to engage in a conversation with me? And, we can't even hear ourselves talking to ourselves in that tone that is, maybe that's a little aggressive for them. But I thought I was being assertive. Turns out I'm not.
And it happens at workplace a lot of times because what I've seen is in the past, when there is a challenge, when we are required to go extra mile at work, we don't have any option. And some people are willing to go extra mile. Some will say, we are not paid enough or we are not getting paid to do this extra job. Why should I work for extra hours? And not being able to take comments and review comments constructively. And this is, now I'm understanding, it is coming from emotionally intelligence side.
Yes, there's a couple of skills specifically related to that great example you just provided is, reality testing and optimism are two skills within emotional intelligence. So if I'm low in reality testing, which means I don't have the capacity to remain objective, see things as they're really going on, especially when I'm emotional, then I won't be able to see that. And if I am low on the optimism scale, then I won't have a positive outlook on feedback that's coming my way either. I may do things like blame the other person, blame the organization, rather than looking inward and seeing, what can I do differently?
And we get into that blame zone. We try to blame others. And this is very powerful. You just mentioned that having reality check and optimism, it's kind of a balance. If we are too optimistic and not doing the reality check, it can go sideways as well.
Oh, yes. Rose-colored glasses, right? Where you just think everything's going to be great. And especially if you're in a leadership role, everything's going to be great. We're going to be fine. And everyone that reports to you is thinking, what? They've lost their mind. Everything's not going to be okay. Aren't they paying attention to all of this important intellectual information we have in front of us? Are they even paying attention to sort of the tone, the emotional tone of everyone else? It's not okay. And we start to lose our trust, confidence, and esteem in our leadership.
This leadership, and this is kind of a very buzzword these days. And I still believe everybody's a leader, even if you don't have a designation of being a leader. Everybody's a leader on their own. What do you think about that?
I agree that everyone has the capacity to lead. Not everyone chooses to lead. Not everyone should lead. But everyone has the capacity. So I think where you might be leading here is perhaps that we all lead our own lives. And so in essence, we all have the capacity to lead. If we're going to step into things like self-care, self-actualization, that's self-leadership. Not everyone has a desire to step into a leadership role that's responsible for other people. And I do believe not everyone should.
And in that scenario, how does EQ play a role for the leader who is leading a team or managing other people?
It can often matter way more than their IQ. Way more than their IQ. In fact, when we place side by side individuals with equal IQ, the one who has higher EQ outperforms their counterpart by 68%. That's a significant difference in performance. High emotional intelligence harnesses some really important qualities in leadership like authenticity. So we think about individuals in leadership roles who are authentic. They command esteem from people because of their transparency in who they are and how they are. They're consistent for us. So we know if we're in times of high stress, chips are down, we're going through a lot of change, this leader is solid as a rock. And that commands esteem from the people who are following them. Another skill is coaching. When we think of the greatest leaders in time, they elevated the people around them. They brought other people to higher levels of performance than even that individual knew that they were capable of. We talk about within leadership this capacity for insight, which basically is communication. So leadership desires to be heard, but it desires to be heard because followers need that vision. They need the goal. They need the why. Yes, exactly. And so high EQ develops the capacity for individuals to be able to speak because they've developed insanely strong relationships. So they know how to communicate, yes, to a group, but they know even more how to communicate to the individual players of that group in a way that drives them towards innovation, drives them into these spaces of creativity, drives them because every person on the team knows they're cared for and knows that it's safe for them to challenge the status quo, to speak up, to present something wild and wacky, and know that their esteem and their worth and their value is not at risk when they do that.
This is all great in terms of emotional intelligence, but I feel sometimes people don't talk about emotions at a workplace. Is that correct?
It can be correct, and that might come from maybe misunderstanding the word emotions. Sometimes it gets a bad rap because it only conjures up for us a sensitivity or an extreme. If we think about asking people, Family Feud survey says the top 5 answers might be, oh, that means people are crying. Oh, that means when people get really angry. Oh, that means when people are super sensitive. And you're like, well, that's part of it, but that's a very small picture of talking about emotions in the workplace. We have to broaden our perspective on what that means.
Is there any online test or any other resource that somebody can go take it to really understand whether they have high EQ or where they stand?
There are online assessments, some that you can certainly access for a very low investment. They aren't insanely accurate, but they will give you a good starting point. In fact, one of the first books that I read that has an assessment within it is Travis Bradberry's book, Emotional Intelligence 2.0, Travis Bradberry and Jean Greaves. And so when you purchase the book, you have access to an online assessment. And it gives you sort of if you're answering honestly, it gives you sort of a starting point as to where you're at and some strategies to start developing, especially your emotional self-awareness. And then if you get into Joseph Stein's book, the EQ Edge, directly in each chapter are questions related to the 5 realms and the 15 skills of emotional intelligence.
And how EQ can help in our personal life, personal relationships?
Well, it can entirely change the landscape. So, for example, my first encounter in my journey, my personal journey for emotional intelligence began because I had a sometimes explosive relationship with my mother from a very young age. We just sort of clashed. And in my early 20s, I had the great fortune of close family members and friends who perhaps knew me, but didn't really know my mom yet. They would see me with her, And they started to give me feedback. They started to say things like, what is up with you when you're with your mom? So they were recognizing a shift in my behavior they had never seen before. And I would simply describe it as, I know I am almost entirely different from my core, and I feel it, and it's gross, it's icky. I don't know what to do about it. And of course, I knew what to do about it. I had to do the internal work. I ended up going to the bookstore and finding a book titled Mama Drama. And that started me towards this path of inwardly reflecting on the emotional triggers that were pushed, if we want to call them buttons that were being pushed when I interacted with my mother, and doing that work to dissolve the judgments, the assumptions, the pre-existing experiences and relationships and belief systems that were ingrained, needing to dissolve that in order for me to regain my emotional control. And by that, I mean, really, I learned how to regulate my emotions by changing the programming that was amplifying them. So every time I was with her, if I started to feel vulnerable, I would armor up with anger. And by dissolving that emotion, what I needed to end up doing was I needed to dial up my empathy. I needed to seek to understand her perspective. I needed to really act from my core value of kindness. And by doing that, I no longer had that programming looping information that she was out to get me. She was attacking me from our past when I was a kid. And that changed dramatically our relationship moving forward, even though she had to do nothing different.
So in that case, your first action item was to read a book, and from there you started on this path of emotional intelligence. And for the listeners who they can pick some book, the books you mentioned, or some other book, or they can go to online, try some tests and find out where they stand and start from there and not beat themselves for anything about it.
Right. Yes. It's a very logical way to approach it. Not everyone is, going to approach it logically. I like to read books. That's how I like to sort of learn and have my mind open. I believe that another very effective way is to spiritually just engage with silence. So sitting in silence and doing that in nature can be a very powerful way of allowing things to surface within ourselves emotionally. And learning to sit with that emotion helps us to process it physically.
Are you saying this is mindfulness?
This is mindfulness.
How mindfulness come with emotional intelligence?
Well, Nishant, I know you're smiling. I can hear it.
Yeah, I want to know.
It's just so beautiful. So stress management is a realm within emotional intelligence. And when we are stressed out, as you know, we have surging and elevating levels of cortisol in our body. Cortisol puts our amygdala, that reptilian part of our brain, in that highly reactive mode. And when our brain is thinking fight, flight, freeze, our emotions are amplified to the maximum. And when our emotions are amplified to the maximum, our logical brain doesn't engage. We can't access it very well. So we do things irrationally. We behave irrationally. We lash out. We go silent. Any of those extremes and anywhere along that spectrum. So mindfulness allows us the opportunity to slow our pace, calm our breathing, pay attention to our physicality, and amp up levels of oxytocin, which directly combats that cortisol. So if we can lower the cortisol, we can physiologically lower our stress levels, gets our amygdala to stop reacting. Now we can start paying attention to our emotional information, which is emotional self-awareness. And then we can start looking into the logical, the experiential part of our emotions, the messaging, the programming, the experience, the judgments. We can start looking at that from a logical standpoint and start adjusting the emotional information.
And it all requires some degree of emotional intelligence to sit with your emotions in the silence and doing mindfulness practices such as meditation. You suggested breathing exercises. And when we have this framework of emotional intelligence, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong anywhere. There is no high degree of emotional intelligence. We can always get better at it. We can always,
Yes, it's something we
improvise
can
on this.
continue to work on. Yes.
We can always get aware of our emotions and how to deal with others, and it can improve our communication skills with others and as well as with ourselves.
Yes.
And then why schools and colleges don't teach EQ? I did not read EQ in my school and college. I don't know now, but it didn't happen years ago.
Yes, wonderfully, there are some schools that are starting to integrate EQ into their curriculum, which I think is just spectacular. It's just very minimal right now. And I agree with you. This would be brilliant to bring into our elementary school system. Why they don't, it's a good question. I believe if we were just to look at what we do with school's all about our IQ. We've been praising and recognizing and recommending grow your intelligence. This is what we value for a really long time. And it's hard to turn that ship when in the workplace, what we're going to school for that workplace. So when we are aiming that IQ for the job we're going to have, workplaces are asking us, what's your education? What's your experience? Tell me, are you smart enough to do this job? And they're really kind of just looking at the IQ side of things. Now, more recently, in the last 5 to 10 years, and especially in the last 5, workplaces are now saying, are you emotionally intelligent? And EQ is growing higher in the ranks as to criteria that workplaces are looking for, which might, from the end point, start to force into the education system emotional intelligence training, because we're going to need it for the jobs that we're applying for.
Because IQ is something that is measurable. We can measure EQ. It's not tangible. It's inside of us. IQ is something, we can write exam and get the numbers out of that. We get the grades, and okay, great, you have a high IQ. And what happens is a lot of people who have great IQs, they may lack big deal of EQ. And with IQ, we can get to a point in our life where we get success, but we get a threshold. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I do. Yes, IQ is measured. We actually become static in our IQ growth, our capacity for learning, by the time we're 18, 19 years old. EQ is also measurable, but it's something we can develop our entire life. So we don't have a threshold for how much we can develop it, but we also don't have a threshold for how long we can learn it and grow our capacity in it, because it's skill-based. So it's things we learn how to do, and we do that through practice, but we also do it through the process of the feedback assessment. So EQ is measured most effectively when we self-assess and have raters assess us. So if we're in the workplace, we want to know, what does our manager think and see and observe? So all EQ questions are based on what we observe behaviorally. What are my peers observing? What are my direct reports observing if I happen to be in a leadership role? What are my clients, stakeholders observing? What are my customers observing? And we also want to know, what are my friends and my family members observing? So we want to see a 360 view of the individual's demonstration of emotional intelligence skills. And this allows us the opportunity to not just measure it, but to measure it accurately, to see the blind spots that exist from a self-perception standpoint. So I might think that I am fantastic at managing stress, and maybe my direct reports think I also am, but my manager disagrees, and my friends and family see something different when they're at home. And then, so that provides...
In that case, how would you know which feedback is the valid feedback? Because our manager can be a douchebag. We don't know.
Yes, exactly. We typically don't choose raters that we know don't have our best interest at heart. So we want to have people answering the assessment. We choose our raters. We want to have individuals that we know will be honest. The EQI 2.0 assessment also has validity markers within the assessment itself. So it will flag if an individual or a rater is overly negative, overly positive, or inconsistent with how they answered. So it will adjust the results based on the validity of the response.
And I think this is just my opinion on this, that top leadership in a corporate world or any workplace, they talk about EQ. Even if they don't talk about it, they have that understanding, they have this perspective to deal with people through emotional intelligence. But middle management may not be talking about it. That is when I'm not biasing towards anybody here. It's just saying that to get to the top level, we get to have high EQ or some level of EQ. Without that, it's very difficult to sustain at the top level.
I think there's an argument that's made on both sides of that coin, that in some people's experience and situation, their executive suite has great EQ and IQ balance, and perhaps management below that does not. And then in other people's experiences, it's the exact opposite. They see the middle management has a greater capacity for EQ than their executive level does. And studies actually demonstrate that as you go higher within an organization's hierarchy, the EQ actually drops. So as you do approach the executive level, the emotional quotient gets lower. And oftentimes that's attributed back to how we promote people into leadership roles. We promote based on performance metrics that are measuring bottom line results. We're not promoting based on EQ, people, leadership, observable traits.
This is very powerful. And there was one article in Forbes that we recognize people based on their performance, what they're doing, not who they are. If you can recognize people for who they are, you're a great dad, you're a great mom. It turns the equation around.
Very much so. That requires authenticity. So someone has to be able to show you who they are, which is an element of emotional intelligence.
It is very tough to showcase your EQ at a workplace. And I can give a small story from my life. I always had high EQ, always had high EQ. But when I started getting into personal development a few years ago, my EQ started getting better and better. Now I deal with people. I can talk about authenticity, being vulnerable, what is going on, and asking them, are you open for the feedback? It is not judging you. Feedback is not a judgment. It is just my experience that I'm having right now in this moment. Are you open? Can we talk about it? And not everybody is open to hearing feedbacks. Not everybody is open to talk vulnerably, and saying and raising your hand in a workplace and saying, I don't know this stuff. I don't know how to execute this idea, but I'm open for learning. I'm open to trying new things. This is not my strength. And it all comes from EQ, right? Do you have any points you want to add on this?
Yeah, trust is a very big component within relationships. And if we think about trust for a minute, trust is a state, and it's determined by the individual to give it. It's not determined by the individual to ask for it. So for example, in our workplaces, a leader does not ask a direct report for their trust. You can trust me. I'm going to give you some feedback. You can trust me. It's to help you. The leader doesn't get to choose that. The direct report gets to decide if they trust or not. And so within the world of emotional intelligence, it's understood that I have to do what it takes to constantly create the climate for trust to exist. And that consistency in my behavior eventually will result in the other person deciding to trust me, but I don't know when that's going to happen. And oftentimes I believe what gets people caught, especially in leadership, is they're demanding it earlier than the individual is willing to give it. And so the leader stops creating the climate of trust. They stop making those consistent deposits. They stop doing the things necessary for the other person to feel safe. Because when I feel safe with you, I'm ready to trust you. Until that time, trust doesn't exist. And then you can do something in a heartbeat and destroy all of the work that was done for trust.
It takes time to develop trust, but it takes no time to lose trust. Do you suggest some practices to develop trust?
For trust?
Yep.
Yes. Well, interpersonal relationship within emotional intelligence is the realm of interpersonal. And the 3 skills that exist within that are interpersonal relationships, empathy, and social responsibility. So if we just take the interpersonal relationship skill set, it's about the skill of developing and maintaining mutually satisfying relationships that are characterized by trust and compassion. So I know that trust isn't something that I can ask for, or I can intentionally say, I'm building trust right now, because the other person decides if it is or not. Let's look at the second word of compassion. What is compassion? Compassion in relationships is me knowing who you are and accepting all of that. So one way to go about it is to take the time, invest the time, genuine interest in the other person, asking them about their life, asking them about more than just what is going on in the workplace, because you actually care to know. Because you know, as a leader, your responsibility is to take care of the people that are working for you. And until that exists, sometimes your people don't care what you know. They don't care if you've got, a high stakes project on the board. If you don't care about me, I'm going to give you discretionary effort every day I come to work.
This is so tough. And I would like to ask you this thing. At a workplace, when we have full-time employees and temporary employees / contractors, usually contractors are not being taken care of by the companies. Not all the time, They're the first ones to get fired, to get laid off. Why leaders not all the time take care of contractors? Only they take care of their full-time employees, even though they are working in the same team.
I'm going to make a leap of an assumption, is that they don't see the value in doing it. For some reason or another, they don't believe that the value invested in taking care of a contractor or even an employee is worth their time. And so they decide not to do it. They don't give it the priority it deserves. Perhaps because I don't believe people just don't care. I don't really think that's a true. They may demonstrate not caring. I don't believe people actually who have stepped into leadership don't actually care, even though we may even hear people say that sometimes. I just don't care. Is that really true? In all likelihood, you're so stressed out by the pressures around you, it's interfering with your capacity to be a human being. And so you're behaving very poorly.
Our emotional intelligence conversation is getting to the workplace. And now I would like to shift some gears and talk about some happiness. How can we elevate happiness through emotional intelligence?
Yeah. I love this question, and I really love talking about this element with clients that I work with, because when you start to focus on your emotional intelligence, the first thing you start to feel is a greater sense of well-being. It's very much like when you've decided you want to start exercising, the first thing you start to feel is you start feeling better. And then you notice that you're losing weight. And then you notice that your heart and lungs are stronger. And then you notice that your muscles are getting stronger. So in emotional intelligence, well-being equals happiness. So it's both your level of happiness or well-being is a contributor to your level of EQ. It's also a byproduct of your development in EQ. So one of the first exercises I do with clients is an exercise in balance. I ask them to place themselves at the center of their universe, because they are, everybody is. And then I ask them to think about and write down all of the areas of their life that are important to them. This could be spiritual, hobbies, work, spouse, family, friends, volunteer, travel, financial. They could have a ton of sort of circles around them as the center of their universe. Then I ask them to populate these circles with, what do you need for your health circle to be fulfilling? 8 hours of sleep. You need to eat well 7 days a week. You need to exercise for an hour daily, get a massage once per month. And they start to populate these circles with what they need for it to be fulfilling for them. And then I ask them to self-assess. Where are you right now on a scale of 1 to 10 in being fulfilled in this area? And it is incredible how many people are not fulfilled in any of their circles or in very few of their circles. And oftentimes what it comes down to is they're not giving the time, energy, and attention to the things that are important to them. And that's why they're unhappy. And by tweaking that dial of starting to dedicate the time that they want to the areas of meaning in their life, their well-being starts to shift. But that comes with acknowledging you might have some feelings of guilt about not being at work 12 hours a day and instead being at work 10 and a half hours a day. And so that's where the emotional intelligence piece comes in, is then we start to learn how to be aware of those emotions, aware of the underlying belief system contributing to the emotion, and doing some reprogramming around what is it that you really want.
And this is going to be a constant process. It's not one size fit all, or you just do it once and you are done forever.
Right. Although some people have a switch and they just turn it off or they turn it on, and they immediately are different in how they're perceiving what's happening around them and within them. And that makes like a cataclysmic shift. It's almost like they take a huge giant step forward and they never return back to that place. But you are correct. That one big step may all of a sudden lighten the load tremendously. And then they have to put in more effort for other changes they're making in their EQ growth.
Is it possible that somebody has good EQ in their personal life, but when they go to work, they switch off their EQ, or the vice versa?
Yes, because EQ is a multitude of skills, and not everyone is balanced across the board, which means not everyone has the same capacity in every EQ skill right out of the gates. And so I could be fantastic when I am at home, and then when I come to the work environment, I put on this mask because I have a belief system that when I'm at work, I'm supposed to be professional, and I'm supposed to have this bravado, and I'm supposed to lead with authority. Yeah. Oh, okay. Amazing.
Long time ago.
Yeah. And so when you remove that mask and you become comfortable in the authenticity of who you are, then you start to balance yourself out. Because I truly believe if you're showing up at work and at home differently, one of you is lying, and you need to figure out which one.
That's amazing. So which one is the right behavior, or who is right? The person who is at the home or person who is at the workplace?
For me, it's not about right. It's who's the truth.
Then who is the truth? And how can we get to know about it? How can we get to know the truth or get closer to the truth?
This does bring us back to mindfulness as a practice, sitting in silence and allowing our thoughts to wander and allowing ourselves to pay attention to how our mind works, what it tells us, becoming used to being the observer to our brain. Because our brain, it's a supercomputer. It's an incredible structure within ourselves. And it does all of these amazing things. So to become an observer of it starts to tune us into, look at the things that I think about. Sometimes I'm not even aware that I'm thinking about them, but I do know that I behave out of those thoughts. So now that I'm more aware of the thoughts that are swirling around in there, in silence, I also become aware of how I feel about them. And my body starts to pick up on physical signals. So I start to become more in tune with a physical signal of an emotion like guilt, or the physical signal of an emotion of aggravation or happiness or surprise. And as soon as I become in tune with my body and I can pay attention to those signals, I learn to pick up on them so much faster. So mindfulness teaches me to be a keen observer of my own physical state, so that when I move or commute from home to work, if I pay attention to my body and I notice, ooh, I'm getting that feeling at the base of my throat, and that means I'm starting to feel anxious about stepping into the work environment because that's when I put the mask on. I can do exercises or strategies when I start to feel it physically to resolve the emotion and keep my logical brain turned on, keep the mask off, remain authentic.
That's powerful. And mindfulness provides the foundation to the emotional intelligence. And it's a daily work. And at a workplace, we can take small breaks and do some mindfulness practice, focusing on our breathing and taking some walks here and there at the workplace, and not just sitting at the computer or on your desk all the time from 9 to 5, if that happens to be.
Yeah, some workplaces are quite amazing right now in providing quiet zones and quiet spaces or meditation spaces in order for us to do that. I'm just not sure in the research or reports as to how many individuals understand how beneficial it can be for them to do that multiple times throughout the day. And also, I think to recognize you don't need to be in complete silence in order to do mindfulness, that you can take the practice of the power of observation, observing of the self, and do it when you're brushing your teeth. Do it when you walk from your desk to go grab a coffee. Do it when you're washing your hands at the sink after using the bathroom. We don't need to have, 10 minutes of uninterrupted, 20 minutes of uninterrupted quiet time in the dark, sitting with our fingers and opening our third eye in order to be mindful.
Yeah, and it's a good practice. I would say a great practice to because our mind keeps wandering onto different thoughts. Even at a workplace, if we are going to a water cooler, our thoughts are towards our work. We keep thinking, what is the next action item? What is happening? When we allow mindfulness to come, we can shift our thoughts to something else.
Yes.
Awesome, Teresa. Thank you. And do you have any other thing to share with our listeners on emotional intelligence?
From personal experience, it has been the best investment of time and energy that I have spent in myself. And the changes it have made have far outweighed any of that time or monetary investment. The individuals that I work with continue to fill my cup and providing me with exactly the same sort of experience, that they could have been taking years of leadership programming, and after 8 weeks of working with me have made leaps and bounds in their development that a year of leadership training has failed to make for them. And I am always honored by that reinforcement of how powerful emotional intelligence development truly is.
Awesome. And where can our listeners find you online?
My website is www.IQ+EQ TQ.com.
What is
and they
TQ?
can also, TQ is my initials, Teresa Quinlan. But it also, in the workplace stands for our talent quotient. And we like to measure organizationally the value of each individual. So it's a little bit of a double meaning there. Mm-hmm. And then on LinkedIn, people can certainly connect with me just by searching my name, Teresa Quinlan.
Well, thank you, Teresa. It was amazing conversation with you.
Thank you, Nishant. It's a pleasure to have been with you this morning.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this podcast episode today. I hope you learned from this episode that you can apply in your life. If you did enjoy this, please subscribe to the podcast, The Nishant Garg Show, on Apple Podcast. You can also subscribe to the show through my website, https://nishantgarg.me, NISHANTGARG.me. You can also share this podcast with your family and friends or whoever want to feel fulfilled. And thank you so much again.